Chapter 39. Ragnar's body was cremated the day after the battle. The Oberjar had died in the final moments before the Temujai had begun their withdrawal. He had died battling a group of 18 Temujai warriors. 2 of them survived, so badly injured they could barely crawl away from the terrifying figure of this Canadian leader. There was no way of knowing who had struck the fatal blow, if indeed there had been one. They counted over 50 separate wounds on the Oberjow, half a dozen of which could have caused death under ordinary conditions. As was the Canadian custom, the body was laid on his cremation pyre as it was, without any attempt to clean away the blood of the or the myrrh of the battle. I think it's Maya. We're gonna go with Maya. Or Marie. Or Maru. I'm gonna go with Maya. The 4 Irelands were invited to pay their last respects to the dead Oberjow, and they stood silently for a few moments before the massive pile of pitch-soaked pine logs, gazing up at the still figure. Then, politely but firmly, they were informed that the funeral of an Oberjow and the subsequent election of his successor was a matter for Scandinavia only, and they returned to Holt's apartments to await events. The funeral rituals went on for 3 days. This was a tradition that had been established to allow Jarls from outlying settlements time to reach Hausholm and participate in the election of the next Oberjarl. Obviously, there were a few Jarls expected from the areas that the Temujai had already passed through, and the majority of the others had already been summoned to repel the invasion, but tradition called for a 3-day period of mourning, which in Scandinavia took the form of a lot of drinking and much enthusiastic recounting of the deceased prowess in battle. And a tradition, of course, was sacred to the Scandinavians, particularly tradition that involved a lot of drinking and carousing late into the night. It was noticeable that the amount of liquor consumed and the degree of enthusiasm in the recognizing of Ragnar's prowess seemed to be in direct correlation. On the second night, Evelyn frowned at the sound of drunken voices raised in song, counterpointed by the splintering sound of furniture breaking as a fight got underway. They don't seem very sad about it, she pointed out, and Holt merely shrugged. It's their way, he said. Besides, Ragnar died in battle as a berserker, and that's a fate that every true Scandinavian would envy. In Giant, it gains him instant entry to the highest level of their version of heaven. Evelyn twisted her mouth in a disapproving pout. Still, she said, it seems so disrespectful, and he did save our lives after all. There was an awkward silence in the room. None of the other 3 could think of a tactful way of pointing out that, had Ragnar survived, he was sworn to kill Evelyn. When she spoke of him now, it was as if she had lost an old respected friend. Horace looked from Holt to Will and back again, waiting to see if either of them cared to raise the matter. All he got was an almost imperceptible shake of his head from Will when he made eye contact. Horace shrugged. If 2 rangers didn't think the matter would rise, who was he to disagree? Worth raising. Who was he to disagree? Finally, the period of mourning was over, and the senior Jarls gathered in the great hall to elect their new Oberjarl. Will said hopefully, "Do you think Eric has a chance?" But his hopes were dashed when Holt shook his head. "He's a popular war leader, but he's only one of four or 5. Add to that fact that he's no administrator, and he's certainly no diplomat either," he added with some feeling. "Is that important?" Horace asked. "From what I've seen, diplomacy is very low on the list of required skills in this country." Hulk acknowledged the point with a grin. "True," he admitted, "but a certain amount of schmoozing is necessary when there's an election among peers like this. Nobody gives their votes because you're the best candidate. They vote for you because you can do something for them. I guess the fact that Eric spent the last few years as Ragnar's chief tax collector isn't going to help either," Will chipped in. "After all, a lot of these people voting are the ones he's threatened to brain with an axe." And again, Holt nodded. "Not a good career move if you hope to be Oberjarl one day." In truth, the ranger was indulging in a mild form of personal superstition by talking down Eric's chances in the election. There were still issues to be settled between Scandinavia and Ireland, and he would have preferred to be settling them with Eric as the Scandinavian supreme leader. Still, the more they talked, the slimmer Eric's chances became. He hadn't known about the tax collecting until Will mentioned it. That would seem to put the final stopper on the Jarl's chances. Not he realized that Eric had shown the slightest interest in becoming Obergau, and after all, Holt's three companions were only interested in his chances because he was a friend and the only senior Canadian leader they knew well. He probably wouldn't make a good Obergau anyway, Horace decided. What he really wants to do is get back to sea in his bullship and go raiding somewhere. The others all agreed. Which only goes to show how wrong you can be when you indulge in reasoned, rational questioning. On the fifth day, the door to Holt's apartment opened, and a stunned-looking Eric stepped in, looked around at the four expectant faces, and said, I'm the new Obergau. I knew it, said Holt instantly, and the other three looked at him, totally scandalized. You did? Eric asked, his voice hollowed, his eyes still showing the shock of his sudden elevation to the highest office in Scandinavia. Of course, said the ranger, shrugging. You're big, mean, and ugly, and those seem to be the qualities Canadians value most. Eric drew himself up to his full height, trying to muster the sort of dignity that he felt an Obergau should assume. Is that how you, Alan, speak to an Obergau? He asked, and Holt finally grinned. No, that's how we speak to a friend. Come in and have a drink. Over the next few days, it began to appear as if the Council of Giles had chosen wisely. Eric quickly moved to end old feuds with other Giles, particularly those he had visited in his role of tax collector, and surprisingly he kept Borsa in the role of Hilfman. I thought he couldn't stand Borsa, Will said, puzzled, but Holt merely nodded his head in acknowledgement of Eric's choice. Borsa's a good administrator, and that's what Eric's going to need. A good leader is someone who knows what he's bad at, and hires someone who's good at it to take care of it for him. Will, Horace, and Evelyn had to think that through for a few seconds before they saw the logic in it. Horace, in fact, was still pondering it some time after the others had nodded and moved on to discuss other matters. As Obergau, Eric would no longer be able to go on his annual raiding cruises at the helm of Wolfwind, and that fact tinged his sudden elevation with a certain amount of regret. But he announced that he would be making one last voyage before he handed the ship over to the care of Svengel, his long-time first mate. I'll be taking you lot back to Ireland, he announced. Seems only fair, since I was the one responsible for your being here in the first place. Will was quietly pleased with the news. Now that the time was almost here to return home, he realized that he would be sad to farewell the big, boisterous pirate. With some surprise, he recognized the fact that he had come to regard Eric as a good friend. Anything that delayed the moment of parting found favor in his eyes. Spring had come, and the geese were returning from the south, and there were deer back in the hills, so there was plenty of fresh meat in place of the dried and salted provisions that had formed the bulk of the winter here in Hausholm. When he saw the first hunting parties return from the high reaches inland of the Canadian capital, Will remembered the debt he still owed. Early one morning, he slipped quietly away on Tug and headed up the trail that he and Evelyn had followed so many months ago in a freezing blizzard. At the little cabin where they had sheltered through the winter, he found the uncomplaining, shaggy little pony who had saved his life. The patient creature had broken the light tether holding him in the lean-to stable behind the cabin, and was quietly cropping the new seasoned grass in the clearing when Will arrived. Tug looked a little askance at his master when Will unfastened a small sack of oats, indicating that it was for the pony only. Will consulted his horse with a quiet pat on the muzzle. He's earned it, he told he told Tug, and the ranger horse shrugged. Insofar as any horse is capable of shrugging, the nondescript pony may well have earned the sack of oats, but that didn't stop Tug's mouth salivating at the sight and smell of them. When the pony had finished the oats, Will remounted Tug and, holding onto the lead rein, rode back down to Hausholm, where he quietly returned the pony to Eric's stable. The night before they were due to leave, Eric threw a farewell banquet in their honour. The Scandinavians were eager to show their appreciation of the efforts of the four Irelands in defending their land against the invaders, and with the shadow of the Val of Swell lifted from Evelyn, they paid particular attention to her, repeatedly toasting her bravery and resourcefulness in continuing to direct the fire of archers as their position was being overrun. Holt, Borsa, and Eric sat in a quiet huddle at the head table, discussing outstanding matters such as the repetition of the reparation of the slaves who had served in the archers' crops. Sadly, many of them hadn't survived the battle, but the promise of freedom had been made to their departures as well, and the details had to be thrashed out. When the subject was finally closed, Holt judged the moment right and said quietly, "So what will you do when the Timidrai come back?" There was a deafening moment of silence as at the head table. Eric pushed his bench back and stared at the small, grim-faced man next to him. "Come back? Why? Why should they come back? We beat them, didn't we? We beat them, didn't we?" But Holt shook his head slowly. "As a matter of fact," he said, "we didn't. We simply made it too costly for them to continue, this time." Eric thought about what he had said and glanced at Borsa for his opinion. The Hillfin nodded a little reluctantly. "I think the ranger's right, Obergel," he admitted. "We couldn't have held out much longer." Then he shifted his eyes to Holt and asked him, "But why should they come back?" Holt took a sip of the rich Canadian beer before he answered. "Because it's their way," he answered simply. "The Timidrai don't think in terms of this season or this year or next year. They think of the next 10 or 20 years, and they have a long-term plan to dominate this part of the world. They need your ships, so they'll be back." Eric considered the point, twisting one end of his moustache in his fingers. "Then we'll best fight them again," he said. "Without archers," Holt said quietly, "and without the element of surprise next time." Again there was a silence. Then Eric said half hopefully, "You could help us train archers, you and the boy." But Holt shook his head immediately and very definitely. "I'm not prepared to provide Scanadium with such a potent weapon," he said. "Once you learn those skills, I'd never know what they might be turned against us in the future." Harry had to admit the logic in the ranger's statement. Scandia and Ireland were traditional enemies, after all. But Borsa, with his negotiator's ear, had caught an overtone in Holt's refusal. "But you do have a suggestion," he said keenly, and Holt almost smiled at him. He'd hoped the Hillfman would see where he was heading. "I was thinking," he said, "that a force of, say, 300 trained archers might be stationed here on a regular basis. They could spend the months of spring to summer here, then be rotated back home during the winter." "Ireland?" Eric asked, beginning to catch on. Holt nodded. "We could supply you with an archery force that way, but if it ever came to hostilities between the countries, I'd feel a lot more secure knowing you wouldn't be turning them against us. We need to stipulate that in the treaty," he added casually. Eric looked cautiously at his Hillfman now. The word treaty seemed to have appeared on the table in front of them without his seeing it arriving. Borsa caught his eyes and shrugged thoughtfully. "I'm proposing that we have a mutual defence treaty for a period of—" Holt seemed to think, and Eric suddenly had the distinct impression that he had weighed every word he was going to say well in advance of this moment. 5 years, let's say. You get a viable force of archers. Eric decided it was time that someone else made the running. "And you get what?" he asked abruptly. Holt smiled at him. "We get a peace treaty that says Scandia won't be launching any surprise attacks on our country during the period, and that, in the event that hostilities become inevitable, our archers would be allowed free passage back home." Eric shook his head abruptly. "I'll never convince my men not to raid," he said indignantly. "I'd be thrown out of my ear if I proposed that," he said, but Holt held up a hand to calm him down. "I'm not talking about individual raids," he said. "We can cope with them. I'm saying no more mass attacks like the one with Morgarth." There was another long pause while Eric considered the offer. The more he thought about it, the more attractive the idea seemed. As well as any of them, he knew how close they had come to being overwhelmed by the Timidrai. 300 trained archers would provide a powerful defensive force to Scandia, particularly if they were deployed in the narrow passes and twisting defiles of the border. He realized with a shock that he was beginning to think like a tactician. Maybe he'd been spending too much time around the ranger, he thought. "You have the authority to sign a treaty like that?" he asked, for the first time Holt hesitated. In fact, he had no authority at all. As a member of the ranger, he would have been empowered to sign, but he had been dismissed from the courts when Duncan had banished him. He could brazen it out now, of course. He was reasonably sure that Crowley or Duncan himself would ratify such a treaty, but when that happened, Eric would know that he had acted falsely, and he didn't think that was a good start to any relationship. "I have," said a quiet voice from behind him, and the 3 men looked up in some surprise. Evelyn, slipping away from the enthusiastic toasting and tributes, had been an interested audience to their conversation for the past few minutes. As Princess Will of As Princess Royal of Arelyn, I have authority to sign on my father's behalf, she told him, and Holt heaved an unseen sign of relief. I think it's best if we do it that way, he said. After all, the princess does outrank me, just a little. Oh, look at that! Alright, that is chapter 39. If you'd like to listen to read chapter 40, then please stay tuned, and hopefully I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.